Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's masterclass, Frontline Defense Real-World Strategies for Securing Citrix Environments. I am pleased to introduce you to our two presenters. We have Eric Buehler, Field CTO of Cloud Software Group, also known as Citrix, and Michael Shuster, CEO of Ferroque Systems. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it off to Michael.
Thanks everyone for joining us here. This is going to be a fun webinar. Eric Beiers and I go back a long time and have always had many interesting discussions on the topic of security. Over at Ferroque Systems, I'm founder and CEO, a bit of a technical role as well in that case, so a bit unique there. And we help customers solve interesting challenges in the end user infrastructure space. So I'll talk a little bit further about that in a moment, but I'll hand it over to Eric to speak a little bit about himself.
Sure. I'm Eric Beiers. I used to be a field CTO at Citrix. I'm now senior director. I run a group called Section 1494, which is a security services organization within Citrix. I've been focused on security for the last decade or so, leading a variety of security initiatives within Citrix, really trying to make customers more secure day on day. So me and Mike have had so many great conversations at conferences, at airports, going really deep into, everything security, AI, all the fun stuff of the world, all the challenges that we see. So we figured it'd be great to have a good conversation about, some of the things that we're seeing and some of the things that we love to see fixed, but also just highly recommend. We have a Q&A section. Feel free to ask us some questions. We do have some time, quite a bit of time to go off script of any existing questions. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Eric. And just a bit about Ferroque. Ferroque is an end user infrastructure focused firm, which means that we deal with everything of EUC and beyond in the organization, in our company, and helping customers of all sizes. And this isn't a sales pitch because our master classes are really focused on delivering useful content to the community and our customers. But we've got a roughly 18-year history in this space. And we've got a solid team that spans North America and with global support as well, providing professional services and managed services. And we do deal with frequently a lot of what we're going to be talking about here in this webinar. So the subject matter that we'll be discussing comes a lot from our field experience working with our customers. So we're looking forward to sharing this with everyone that we can.
So Michael, your team in general is constantly parachuting into customer environments. I think that's what's great about partners is they see so much of the world and they see the different ways something can be done. They also see different ways stuff could be done wrong, I think. So what do you find like constantly surprises you around security when you're parachuting or seeing these customer environments for the first time? What surprises you the most?
Yeah, and what'll be interesting here is that we cover every major industry, and from customers as small as 20 users up to over 300,000. So there's a lot of commonalities that we see there. And what's still common is that there tends to be gaps in policy and reality. Customers have been moving away over the last 10, 15 years from the MFA at the edge, and then everything is trusted internally. So they'll have MFA everywhere, wall to wall. But then they've got exceptions for service accounts and break glass accounts or whatnot, and exceptions can be deadly. So those really need to be scrutinized because we've seen attacks that have taken advantage of those. Also, again, just on that topic, assuming the internal network is trusted, thus multi-factor authentication isn't needed. That is an old way of thinking that went out the door at least 10 years ago. So customers often will enforce that everywhere to align with a zero trust mandate, but then they forget to do it on every portal. And things get missed during a rollout of such a mandate, and that's perfect for hackers to take advantage of, to get into, and then harvest credentials, which has been a known incident in a couple of major cases that hit the news where attacker got in through one way and then got into a trusted system that had single factor authentication enabled, just sat there and harvested credentials and then used that data to move laterally throughout the network. Lack in visibility and governance. You need to know what all your systems are, what IPs you have, especially publicly, and are they fronted with multi-factor authentication if there's a login point. Shadow IT spinning up single-factor VPNs, then forgetting about them, and the security team isn't even aware. That constant visibility to be pulling what's going on for all your owned IPs at the edge is really, really important and has unfortunately been missed by some folks and thus got exploited in some larger enterprise in particular. One that we see all the time, although there is a couple of mitigations out there for this, but we don't see it consistently rolled out. Domain and enterprise admins being allowed to log into the same systems that end users do, such as VDIs or physical endpoints, which leaves exploitable vectors. Flipping it around, Eric, you see data from the vendor side of things, and what could go wrong globally. When a customer gets hit with any sort of attack, whether it's ransomware or just a well orchestrated hack and what have you, it's usually some sort of 0 day, or is it basic vulnerabilities that have been out for a while? What do you typically see?
Definitely not 0 day. Unfortunately, it is overwhelmingly the basics that we see as the initial vector to compromise. You mentioned MFA. MFA is all about creating a sufficient amount of friction, one that provides enough friction such that you've validated the user is who they say they are, and it's not just a trivial username and password, but also not too much friction that the user circumvents it. And we also see MFA not consistently deployed, as you mentioned, the single factor VPN, but we also see storefront internal. Oh, the user, storefront internal has single factor, but externally we're MFA'd. And they consider being on the network as a factor of authentication. So for internals, we don't need single factor, and I would argue against that. There's too many systems that are stood up without other teams knowing about it. There's other ways into networks. We need to always have a certain level of friction applied. When we talk about 0 days, we are really adamant about having a responsible disclosure program, and we very much try to release fixes the same day the vulnerability is announced to the world, and we've had a good track record of that. But that doesn't always translate to being called a 0 day, and really the real challenge is the time to reverse engineer exploits once a patch is available is reducing day over day. So I will say we need to get on top of our patching schedule and upgrade processes, and specifically stuff at the edge, right? The things that are exposed at the external edge of your network are the highest targets, highest level targets, because they're the most exposed. So definitely thinking about patching those systems as quick as possible, really important, but also using some sort of a tool set to centrally monitor all those systems to make sure that you can update them, that a system wasn't forgotten. That's the thing. Like, we can build all these systems. Oh, we have MFA, we have certificates, we have this, we have that. But if we don't have systems and programs to actually validate the human factor that somebody didn't forget a box to upgrade, or maybe the secondary node wasn't updated, right? The primary node was updated, but the secondary wasn't. And then a week later, you have a failover, and then suddenly you have a vulnerable system on the network, and it's a week after. So the vulnerability is being exploited publicly. So it's rarely magic. It's rarely, the difficult stuff, of the movies of Mr. Robot and all of that, right? A username and password or a stolen, credential token is often that first step, right? So we really have to go back to basics, I feel, with hardening, and really social engineering is another one, right? We do all this work to try to protect and use math to solve security, or use AI to solve security, or whatever the fad is of the day, but the human element is always part of this mix. So we can do tremendous amount of end user training, but if you have 10,000 or 100,000 users, your effectiveness of that training is never close to 100, and not close enough to 100%, to an adversary who's willing to call 10,000 users on a phone, right? So, social engineering, has definitely been a bit of a challenge for us. And there's lots of really good, useful things like app protection and things like that, and additional monitoring and possible travel. Those kinds of things can sometimes help quite a bit. So think about social engineering, we can harden the tech, but how do you see your teams handling that human element?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll go back to that in a second, but just to add on to what you said there is this thing about 0 days and what have you. This is something that's endemic in the industry in general, right? I mean, even just I think in the last 24 hours, last week, there was some critical vulns released for a particular well-known firewall vendor, and their SSO component got hit. And within days, there was active exploits of that. So when you move slow on these things, there is real world impact. So there absolutely does need to be better process in place to start jumping over a lot of the typical change control delays or whatnot. The people need to start rethinking their ITIL processes, I find, in organizations to speed up in order to get ahead of these vulnerabilities, because especially at the edge, it causes a lot of problems, just to put it mildly. Now, back to your last question there.
I'm gonna cut you off
It's
again.
yeah,
So we know the general cycle of when vulnerabilities and specifically security bulletins are published, right? So we, just like most of the industry, aim for a patch Tuesday cadence, right? Second Tuesday of the month. There's a that's generally when we try to do a responsible disclosure with our fixes, all of those things. Sometimes it's not always viable if something else is happening worse in the world, right? We also have a pre-notification program at Citrix, right? Where if you check out our Trust Center, there's a pre-notification program, and you can learn about the vulnerability announcement coming out a week in advance. In general, to learn the criticality of the vulnerability and which products are impacted, so that you could properly schedule your team. But
that's a good point.
and I think if you're not part of that pre-notification program, I really feel every Patch Tuesday you should expect 3 to 5 of your vendors to have some sort of an announcement. And really, you need to be able to take that announcement, understand the criticality rating, right? We use CVSS 4.0 now, we publish that score, but we use that to sort of educate and show, hey, this is the criticality of the situation. Use that with your own risk posture, with your own risk judgment to understand how your systems are actually impacted or potentially have some risk, and then schedule appropriately, right? If it's an edge system and it's a critical 10.0, like this firewall vendor, right? Or this SSO vendor, or even us, realistically at 10.0, that's a really significant thing. At that point, you should be thinking, I need to patch today. How do I do that? Or do I start turning off systems, right?
Yeah.
If I don't patch today, can I patch tomorrow? Is there any other mitigating things I can do? Can I increase my logging? Can I watch these systems? Can I reduce other things that reduces my exposure and go down to a reduced capability stack? Maybe we don't allow new IP addresses for a day onto our network. Things like that can sometimes be taken advantage of.
All right, back to your social engineering question there.
Yeah, that's a good
It
one.
is getting harder from from the news. Help desks are being targeted aggressively, as you mentioned. Attackers calling in, pretending to be executives in a panic. Whatever the case may be, right? It's gotten easier than ever to assemble armies of people to go ahead and do this. It's not just one or two people in a random office somewhere across the world or whatnot doing this. There's whole call centers full of people doing this. And we find that the less mature the company or MSP provider is, the more likely they lack strict processes for handling things like password resets and account lockouts. And even in more mature organizations, we find from occasional prodding during our security assessments that the processes are not always followed. And this requires behavioral reinforcement, right? So what we're talking about here is, again, most enterprise organizations these days already have a self-service password reset piece in place. And usually that can protect against a lot of abuse and exploits. But there's always going to be a secondary process to handle password resets manually. Phone call, maybe something's got screwed up. And the SSPR is not working, or they lost their phone, and everything needs to get reset from top to bottom, what have you. Then password resets that are handled by help desk should have manager approval, callback verification, and ideally credentials set to a person's manager for them to deliver to the user. Just something to think about there. Gut feelings cannot be relied upon by the help desk person that's dealing with the call to make a judgment on how they should be delivering the credentials. It's essentially handing over hypersensitive information keys to a kingdom. And maybe not to a kingdom, I guess it depends on the user. But the point is, it's sensitive information that needs to be triaged properly audited, documented, and handed in such a way that you know darn sure who exactly you're giving these credentials to. Ideally, the actual person that is the true person that owns that ID. Similarly, with MFA resets, they also need equal scrutiny and strict policy control. And this sometimes gets missed too, we find. This could be an attacker with harvested credentials trying to bypass MFA, so on and so forth. So if someone's calling in because they've got a new phone or what have you, there needs to be due process there in order to get around that. I mean, we've had some customers that will go to the extent of having MFA on their phone set up, And then they also have a pass key that's also usable. So if the user can, if the user needs to swap out their phone, they can authenticate using another secondary secure factor, so they can continue to be self-service and not rely on having to call a help desk and deal with the higher risk and uncertainty of that coming through, of dealing with those types of requests. All right, on the topic of guardrails, let's talk attack surface. We used to just put everything on the internet. What's your philosophy on what should actually be exposed, Eric?
Um, Here's the thing. Exposing anything is a problem, right? Remote access can be considered a vulnerability in some mindsets, right? So any form of access is a concern. So we should scrutinize all forms of access, all forms of exposure, and reduce it to the absolute minimum. When we think about risk management, we think about mitigating, transferring, accepting risk. But if I can avoid the risk, right, eliminate the entire exposure from that component, then I don't have to worry about these other partial risk mitigation techniques that aren't always complete and comprehensive. So, it is definitely hide as much as possible and expose as, a little as possible, right? And, there is going to be some things that have to be exposed, right? You have a public website, you have, um, an authentication portal, you need to VPN in or provide remote access to Citrix or whatnot. So there is something that has to be exposed, but it shouldn't be an IIS, web server in the public space, right? It really should be behind a NetScaler, well protected, and that NetScaler to be, doing very little, in an exposed sense, right? So really reducing it as much as possible, and what's in your DMZ only exposes a handful of ports and protocols externally. We used to have the old joke, what's the most secure computer? It's the computer in your backyard that's in a cement jacket, right? The one that's not connected to anything. And that's not a reality. We need to stay connected. So there is certain things that need to be out there, but we have to consider that exposure to be a risk and how to manage that risk and how to continually refine and reduce what is exposed. Minimize exposure, simplify your edge, reduce the number of products at your edge. What is left, monitor very closely. It's pretty much, it's the good goal or attack surface. So before we move on to the next section, maybe we'll do a poll or two. Maybe we do the first poll because really one of the things we've been battling for a while is MFA, right? MFA, we all think it's comprehensive, but it's not, right? When I talk to somebody, like, oh, do you have MFA? Yes, they have MFA. But once again, is it everywhere or is it just on a couple key components? So if you wouldn't mind just answering this question, and then we'll have a moment to chat about it.
Yeah, and when we're talking comprehensive MFA, it's on essentially every application and end to end. There is no such thing as a trusted network in this discussion of this. It's whether you're inside the office, right beside the data center, or you are remote on a beach or whatever, it's MFA. So that's the definition that we're using here of comprehensive MFA.
Alrighty, it is slowing down and it looks like 100% everywhere has taken the cake.
Was
Not by
not
much though.
expecting that, but
It's
okay,
close.
that's good to.
Second is external only.
My
I know
faith in
some
humanity has been restored.
I know some people on this call. I know that answer is not true. It's not 100% everywhere, right? Is it? But it's pretty close. But yeah, I don't. I think we have to be suspicious of that and continually be on the watch for additional portals and additional things because frankly, there's always a few things. There's maybe an administrative console, like a director console that's single factor or
That's also true. Yeah.
licensing
A
console.
healthy sense of paranoia is always welcome in this day and age.
Yeah. But if you are
Yeah.
100%, congrats. Maybe you have a great system and all of that. One thing that drives me crazy is unencrypted traffic, right? We had Heartbleed several years ago, and then suddenly everybody jumped on that TLS and SSL bandwagon. But we just like encrypt all the things. Why wouldn't you encrypt all of the things? Why are you sending communication across an untrusted network in a plain text format? So we see XML in the clear on the internal network. We see so many different forms of unencrypted traffic. Michael, why do you think that's still happening? Like, what's the challenge?
Yeah, so speaking specifically about Citrix XML traffic between a delivery controller or cloud connector and a storefront server, or even STAs with a gateway or something. To be candid, it's a lack of education as far as I'm concerned. And frankly, I've always felt, I mean, not to prod too much at Citrix product management, but we've been dealing with securing XML since the IMA days. And this ought to be something that's handled a little more eloquently as far as I'm concerned. There is some super base level encryption on it by default, but it's easily decryptable. Any 12-year-old with access to Google can take an XML response unencrypted and look at the content of that. So yes, I do believe it should be ideally handled within the product, but failing that, it's just people not doing the work to actually secure that when you've got a storefront server in the mix. Sometimes I hear there's fear of legacy configurations being impacted, but I frankly feel that's generally a cop out. Excuses do not ward off vulnerabilities. Sorry to burst your bubble. There really is zero excuse for XML being secured on delivery controllers and cloud connectors if you are using storefront. Usernames and groups and app entitlements, all that stuff gets transmitted in XML in essentially not so much in clear text, but easily decrypted. And that information, even though the passwords might be hashed in the transfer, all this information can be harvested and used as telemetry for further attacks. Attackers in the last decade are incredibly patient. You always hear of attackers that have been harvesting data within a company system for years or more or whatnot. And they'll gather what they need over months, years to make focused, measured attacks. And what you might feel is trivial, like usernames and user groups that might be logged in XML traffic, could be the very missing piece they need because it just helps fill in gaps, add context, and help them build a map of where to start exploiting next. And we also need to stop treating the internal network by and large as trusted. If you prescribe to zero trust, you don't trust any network implicitly. The edge of the network is surely riskier, obviously, than an internal network segment, but it's not without risk. And attackers who manage to move laterally into more internal networks will go to town with such oversights, and they often do time and time again. And when we get called into security assessments, usually post-attack assessments that a company is required to come in to help do some forensics on an analysis on what happened and how to secure the environment going forward. That is a common thing that we've seen. Some managed to get in through and their session was compromised through an endpoint, and then they got into a more trusted network where things were more lax and we're able to start moving laterally into flatter networks or networks with weaker security, 3389 being open to various servers or whatnot from an endpoint, let's say, and they just go to town.
Yeah, I think that's XML and that's infrastructure communication that's occurring. And there's ways to apply a certificate and just force it to be encrypted, and trusted communication. There's actually many forms of encrypted traffic within a Citrix implementation. And one of the
Yep.
ones that gets me is end user encryption. How are we encrypting the traffic flow of the user's session itself? And if we go back in time, there was no encryption at the beginning, and then we added secure ICA, which is RC4 based. Not really considered strong encryption. I consider it more
No.
obfuscation. It gets you by the odd PCI auditor that's not paying attention, but in reality, it's not really doing anything other than obfuscation, right? So
Yep.
really what we've seen standardized, and not to say it's the destination, is TLS from the end user to the netscaler, right? Terminate on the netscaler a TLS connection at the edge of your network. It's pretty common because Workspace app really wants that, right? You have to go out of your way to do a plain text based initial connection. So, most people have TLS to the netscaler or TLS to the edge. But to your point, the traffic from the netscaler in your DMZ to the internal shouldn't be considered, shouldn't be plain text, right? So we did
And there's
introduce.
like two options for that, right? You've got your TLS VDA, and I think something replaced secure ICA in a recent version that's more palatable now.
Yeah, we have three things now. Let me go over them real quick.
Okay.
So first off is TLS all the way to the VDA. So we had the enable SSL script, PowerShell script from several years ago. The challenge with that was it does allow essentially communication from the client to the netscaler encrypted, and then the netscaler re-encrypts and sends it to the VDA encrypted, right? So it's not end-to-end encryption. It's terminated in the middle, so it allows us to inspect and look at the virtual channels, look at stuff. And both ends of the NetScaler is trusting either end, so it's quite okay. But the real challenge with that was really the certificate rollout, right, to the VDA, to provisioned images. It's an operational effort. It's not a difficult one. It's just something additional to do. And once we created that script several years ago, it became pretty common for our high security customers to do that. But then they had to manage the certificate. They had to manage those rotations. They had to manage, all of this stuff. So Citrix came out with a couple more options, right? We have HDX Direct, which just built into it has encryption, right? That was the other one. But the new one that we're all talking about is Secure HDX. And this is really interesting. So what it is, it's end-to-end encryption. So the TLS connection from the client all the way to the VDA is encrypted, which brings some new challenges, right? It means the NetScaler is not decrypting the traffic on the fly, which means now I don't have the ability to inspect the traffic at the NetScaler and apply additional rules. Now it has some challenges with service continuity. Now it has a few challenges, and whatnot. So I would highly recommend everybody to look at Secure HDX and specifically look at the prerequisites and look at the issues with it. Right? There's only a couple of minor issues left with it. We're working really hard to get rid of those issues. They're known issues. They're kind of design issues. The challenge of something in the middle that's trying to control the traffic that can't see the traffic. Right? We needed to build something so that the VDA would talk back to the middle so that the middle could control the VDA traffic some better. So we're working through those limitations. But Secure HDX gives us that end-to-end encryption, and we saw a large increase of asks around end-to-end encryption. I really blame Facebook for this, or Apple Messenger, or whatever. Right, your standard messaging applications started introducing end-to-end encryption because people were concerned about their privacy. Right, we had Signal, we have all these other messaging techniques, so the general messaging communication stuff started doing end-to-end encryption, meaning that people in the middle couldn't listen anymore. So now we have end-to-end encryption into the product. So that's something that you can bring to your management and say, hey, this is an improvement, right? This is an improvement where, we're not able to do man in the middle anymore. It's end-to-end encrypted. And the difference is you're same with HDX Direct. You're using self-signed certificates and you're leveraging the trust that Citrix already has with the system. And self-signed certificates, everybody in security like boos them automatically. But what you don't like about self-signed certificates is a general like website you set up and you do a self-signed certificate, and then when you land on it, you get a certificate warning because your client has no way to validate it. It's a clean certificate chain, right? We get rid of that challenge because we do the middle stuff for you, and we simplify it. So HDX
Context is important. Yeah.
Yeah. I have so much more to say.
Yeah, we got a lot to go through. Let's talk about session breakouts. We lock the front door, but once a user gets a desktop, how often do you see them able to hop into, I don't know, a domain controller?
I really wanted to talk about security keys.
You want to talk about go talk security keys.
I'll save it for later, but the highlight is security keys was introduced to the product. Nobody's using the feature, but it really is important if you're using certificates for authentication or anytime that you have an XML trust, please enable security keys. What it allows us to do is establish trust between, say, the NetScaler and the storefront, and it allows us to communicate securely, effectively. Nobody's we implemented this or released this feature like a year and a half, 2 years ago, but nobody's using it. So
let's put it this way: what risk is it solving? Right? Like, what's it solving for? Simply, in one sentence.
I don't want to say. It's the trust between components could be invalidated. How's that?
Okay.
That's a cryptic way to put it. I don't want to.
You're establishing mutual trust between an XML broker and a storefront server.
Yeah, where you've put based off configuration, you've said, hey, implicitly trust everything, so that basically somebody could impersonate a NetScaler or a storefront in the communication and then have half the communication. So,
and does that become even more important if you've got trust XML requests enabled at the site level?
If you're not, then you're automatically trusting everybody.
Yeah. And there's a lot of features that one enables that relies on that. So yeah, hopefully the
So
audience takes note of that feature.
yeah, and some of our documentations, like app protection, even mentions it, and yet you only need that for the installation. You don't actually need to keep it enabled. So,
Mm.
anyways, you asked me about session breakouts. Session breakouts, like cryptography is a whole thing I could talk an hour about. Session breakouts or Citrix breakouts, they've been a challenge, and really it's a later stage attack, right? Like most break-ins occur because username and password is broken, or a user is willing to give away their MFA token for a candy bar or something like that. And that initial exploitation is all that happens. But after a user session is compromised in some way, the attacker is effectively on a Windows host, maybe in a published application or a published desktop, and you're trying to provide the user, not the attacker, a tool set, right? So maybe you're trying to provision Notepad, and that's your goal, right? It's just I want to provision Notepad to the user, but you forgot, or we always have to remember, there's all this other exposure, right? There's a printing dialog, there's a help dialog, there's a file save as dialog. There is a variety of ways in which you can escape just a basic application to get to the underlying operating system's file system, right? Or run an application that was never meant to. So, so session breakouts is this concept where you're provisioning something and then the attacker tries to run some other tool, right? And usually it's a tool to elevate privilege or move laterally or do some reconnaissance of the environment or understand, run mimikatz or use some security tools or something like that. The interesting thing is like this is multiple layers of defense, right? We need to think about where we allow users to save files and what permissions that they have there. Can they save a file to the same place they're allowed to execute a file? Then you've basically built the system such that the user can save any file that they want and that they have the ability to then run that file. And like think about the MS Paint example, which is the one that I think is just a silly example, but it's an amazing example. MS Paint, when it saves a bitmap file, it's actually writing a binary file. What this allows you to do is to actually use MS Paint to draw a binary that you want. So you provided a painting application to the user. The user can paint something and create themselves a command prompt or paint themselves a PowerShell application.
Okay,
If you've
that's
allowed,
wild.
if you've allowed them to save to the directory that MS Paint's allowed to save to, and then you've also you haven't blocked execution rights, you can then run the security tool. That's crazy, right? That's just crazy. That's like at some point you got to put your hands up and go, okay, I can't block everything and I can't block the unknown. So really we need to dive into some sort of application restriction technology, right? So, the one that jumps out as the standard is the app locker technology, right? So it's built into Windows and it allows you to do allow lists or deny lists. It allows you to do it based off of paths, allows you to do it based off of file names, extensions, hashes of the file, very useful, or specific vendors, that release software. So AppLocker is very useful, but it's kind of going away, right? It's not being invested into. WDAC is kind of the future for future operating systems. There's a bunch of other vendors out there that do various forms of app lockering or restricting which processes are allowed to run. Because what we're trying to do is actually create a trusted execution environment, right? One that, hey, I'm publishing these applications. Every process that runs in there has been blessed by my IT organization. If I allow any process to run, then that means it's not a trusted execution environment. I could be running malicious software that attacks the hypervisor, that attacks the AD, that attacks the local operating system, that attacks other users on that system. So we're trying to build this trusted execution environment, and we need some way to control which processes are allowed to run. But there's always challenges. There's oh, what if? Oh, I actually do need PowerShell. Oh, I actually do need this. I need that, right? So with workspace environment management, we added some stuff for controlling some of the execution. So we within workspace environment management can say which application can launch which other application. Very useful because you might still need PowerShell for your login script, but you don't want the user to have PowerShell once they've logged in. So very useful technology there. And then I also overlay that with Uber Agent or some technology like that. I can use Uber Agent to list off all the processes that run in my environment. and which processes launch which processes environment. So I now have a full list of everything I consider that has been running for the last couple months. I can go through that list and say, hey, everything in here is perfect and healthy, and I've had no exploits and etc. So all of this then becomes my allow list, and then everything else is denied by default. You can do it that way. You can do it a few different techniques, frankly, but coming up with different ways to understand which processes are normal and which ones aren't. This goes back to that operational challenge. It is a challenge if you do this right. If you do it right, which is every process that ever needs to run in your environment, the hash of those binaries. Every time there's an update, you have to go then update all of your hashes. You have to go update all your allowed lists. So most people don't start with the final goal, which is, they often start with just blocking the worst of the worst, right? Let's block PowerShell, let's block C script, let's block, Git and stuff like that, and those tools like that. And then go from there, build your allow list. But I'm always a fan of like layering this security, right? If I run a couple environments and I've done all this hardening and all this that I've talked about. Every once in a while, something sneaks through, right? So I still have antivirus, I still have anti-malware, I still have other tools watching a system, alerting for the first time a process has ever been executed. Let's send an alert to a SIM. Let's have other layers of security because, frankly, everything in security is fallible. But what we want to do is build an environment that's a trusted environment. We know everything that's running in there. I can go for another 10 minutes on that rant, but I think that's a good place to put a pin in it.
Yeah,
We do
I just
have
want to add a couple things to that. So
yeah,
go ahead.
we do have a quick question. What are your thoughts on Threat Locker? Uh,
I've
we've
never used
talked.
it.
Okay.
They approached me last week, and I pretended I didn't know who they were, and it was kind of funny to see threat lockers like, you don't know who we are, and I'm like, eh. It seems to be a product out there that is in use. They are at conferences, they are presenting, they are one of the larger vendors that are specifically trying to attack a part of this problem. I don't know of why I would use that when the built-in Windows tools are effective. I think it's a matter of that operational challenge I was talking about. Maybe ThreatLocker helps with that. I don't know. Like I said, so there's a couple other vendors out there that are in the same
Yeah.
world that do the same thing. Um, I haven't heard anything bad about them or
Yeah.
compatibility issues. I should say that.
One thing I will say, and just on this topic, because I could go on this for a while, is that the one thing that is often getting missed, we find, and this is something we're going to be advocating more and more, even in our advisory work and consulting work, is you can have all the fancy security monitoring tools, security tools on your systems and your stack, EDRs, malware, so on and so forth. That's fantastic. You can throw all the money at the world at it. But if you do not have the fundamentals down, like actually hardening your base operating system out of the gate, you're already at a massive disadvantage. You're just making life so much more easy for any attacker that gets into your system. It's not just about app locker. There is just by virtue of Windows being a 40-plus-year-old operating system, there are so many things by default that ought to be hardened, turned off, configured in a particular way to reduce overall attack surface. That should be done as one of the first things you do when you are building a master image or either from scratch or by infrastructure as code. So that's item number one. I just want to add to that the importance of hardening the baseline OS and not just assuming that your security tool stack just handles everything, because it doesn't. And if something
Well,
does get past it, your monitoring tools, provided you're even watching it in a real time basis, are really just going to act as forensics in a best case scenario when someone wants to look back and go, "What happened?"
how many times have you seen a baseline where it's the baseline of their server operating system image? It's not the baseline of their Citrix image, right? So they've
Yeah,
applied a generic set of rules saying, hey, we've applied the standard whatever, but then it's like, yeah, but what about the remote?
100%. People need to remember that
Yeah.
when you're, let's say in the case of Citrix or Omnisa or AVD, whatever the case is, whether it's a server or a desktop operating system that you're hosting these sessions on, you're hosting users on them. You're hosting users. Direct users are logging into these systems, and I'm going to say you need to treat them like a biohazard. It needs an extra layer of scrutiny and hardening on those systems. All right, Eric, you want to talk about NetScaler?
Or do I? I love NetScaler. It is the most powerful network appliance I've ever used. It's why I came to Citrix, frankly, is I used it. I was impressed by it. Couldn't find its limitations, and I could do everything with it. And I came to Citrix because of NetScaler. That's a very honest truth. I feel it's a beast, right? And it has so many features, but so many people use one or two features out of it. What do you feel, in a security sense, where is NetScaler not being used where it has the opportunity right now?
Yep, for sure. And hey, let's face it, NetScalers run the internet. They handle over 75% of the world's internet traffic. That is a fact. If you run an Android phone-based phone, if you run an iPhone using iCloud, you shop on eBay, Amazon, AWS, Azure, that all runs via NetScaler. It's the most battle-tested ADC on the market. That's like full stop. That's just pure fact. It's not marketing. I would have to say that the WAF feature is likely the top on this, specifically for the NetScaler gateway itself. That was a challenge that existed, as Eric, you know well, for quite a while, how to implement the WAF feature on the NetScaler appropriately. The challenge historically was only the NetScaler can terminate ICA traffic. If anything else tries to terminate the ICA traffic, like an upstream WAF appliance, it breaks. So there used to be fancy ways with third-party WAFs to essentially use HDX routing and separate out the ICA traffic to be directly handled by the NetScaler, and then the authentication traffic, which is where most of the perceived risk might come from, that could go through an Imperva or some other WAF or whatnot. They finally got the bulk of or actually all the issues more or less sorted out, and were able to actually get the NetScaler inbuilt WAF feature to run directly on Gateway some years ago, which is something that a lot of folks internally, partners, customers were asking for a long time. And although there's been a lot of uptake of that feature because it's a very Ronco set it and forget it type of thing, there's still more work to do for customers to be enabling. But it's super easy to configure. It's just a few checkboxes. And I want to say, with customers having started to adopt this, it's actually created an interesting bit of misinformation out in the market that I've heard about. I've seen a lot of competitors to NetScaler talking about how NetScalers are dropping off the internet and how they must be an indication that customers are moving off. When in fact, there is actually a significant increase in customers enabling that WAF feature on the NetScaler, which essentially is also removing the fingerprinting techniques that usually reveals the appliance type that owns a given IP address. And we've seen this firsthand. Like, even the last vulnerability that came out, there was someone that was maintaining a GitHub repo that was running a script that would go pull all the IPs on the internet somehow, and would come back and indicate, yep, this is a NetScaler, this is a NetScaler, this is on a version, this version, that version, this version, that. Anything that showed up on that list was one that was not actually using the NetScaler WAF feature in front of it. When we had a significant amount of our customers, either ones that we consult for or that we manage their NetScaler fleet, that does have the setting enabled, and none of them appeared on that list. So it was just amusing and misinformation because, these NetScalers are disappearing on the internet. The market share must be shrinking. It's like, bro, you don't want no device, a NetScaler or otherwise, an F5, a Cisco appliance, you don't want anyone to be able to fingerprint that stuff. It's just good security to keep that information private. But there you go. So WAF on the gateway feature, I think, is number one. But being that a significant amount, if not majority of the majority of traffic that NetScalers are used for have nothing to do with gateway. We got to remember architecturally that NetScaler is an ADC that the NetScaler gateway and AAA functions were shoehorned into after the acquisition that Citrix did years ago. So it's just a component. The majority of the internet traffic that NetScaler processes have got nothing to do with Citrix or gateway stuff. So on that front, honorable mentions for things that should be enabled, whether it's a Citrix deployment-based NetScaler or not: rate limiting, geo-blocking, the IP reputation service, HTTP callouts if you want advanced malicious IP detection, Often we'll tell customers if they're doing this on an upstream device and they can confirm it, confirm being the key phrase here, not just taking their word for it. Don't bother doing it on the NetScaler so you're not getting in weird security situations where you're pointing this way because you've got rate limiting set on two completely different places. But if they aren't doing it upstream someplace, then absolutely do it on the NetScaler. It's really easy to do and eliminates a lot of attack vectors and reduces a lot of noise in the network.
Yeah, I think Gateway WAF, it's such an obvious feature. It's so easy to implement. It is not a complex thing. And we've made it so that it was simple, that you just basically turn it on and you have some baseline protections. In addition to that, we have a technique called virtual patching that'll allow us to push encrypted signatures down to an endpoint. We did actually leverage that in the last security bulletin to a handful of customers, really on a case by case basis. But it is very useful. And if you're not using Gateway WAF, like Michael was saying, it kind of hides you a bit from the internet. And like some of these tools, they're just scanning the internet and like yeah, like I said, our numbers went down because we turned on a security protection that hid the NetScaler. We didn't bother telling anybody, hey, your scanners are broken. Now we just have on this webinar. So that's fun. I think the other one I'm watching for right now in NetScaler is what we're doing around MCP, the AI gateway in the future there, right? We're doing a bunch of stuff on the NetScaler with post-quantum cryptography and hybrid post-quantum cryptography. Like that's super interesting and bleeding edge. But I think the MCP stuff also should be really interesting for us in the coming years. Do you want to do a poll question on WAF? Question 3, I believe. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, that's not a WAF one, but we should get that one out of the way.
What was that?
Apologies. I'm pulling up the last one. Here you are.
There we go.
Hosts can't vote. Easy, apparently.
I feel oppressed.
Answers are
Okay.
coming in. Wow, thank you all for participating.
All right. Well, we wrap that up. Let's talk about unused security features. Citrix, being this is a Citrix related webinar, has got a lot of bells and whistles. And is there a feature that you see turned off that makes you want to scream?
It used to be virtual channels. It used to be like our defaults were allowing a lot of virtual channels, and they're extremely powerful and they're scary in a way. If everybody realizes virtual channels allows you to write some software for your endpoint and software for your VDA and try and communicate through there. So effectively, you can build yourself a proxy that you didn't plan on building for your users. You can build a whole bunch of stuff. So hardening of virtual channels used to be it. We've improved some of the defaults, but they still need to be revisited. Frankly, virtual channels just should be locked down if you're not using certain things. App protection, it actually helps more than just PCI designs. App protection blocks screen sharing and copy paste, but there's been several social engineering pivot attacks that it blocks, where you convince a user that, hey, install TeamViewer and let me use your Citrix session to resolve your issue. So that one's really neat. Watermarking, it's definitely something easy to turn on.
It's a deterrent.
Yeah, it's not that useful. Session recording, it's not that useful to actually block. It's just a deterrent. Yeah, you're right. Session recording, I think that's a sleeper hit. I feel people saw it early on. Hey, it's just recording sessions. Maybe I have some privacy concerns. I don't want to do that. Or maybe there's some use for it for troubleshooting and stuff like that. But we actually have been slowly improving that over the last several years. So we've actually
They
started,
got some features in there that I asked for a while, which is great. So yeah, for sure.
like, we're essentially watching the session a little bit, right? So we're understanding the window titles and generally what's happening in the session now. So it effectively has become a lightweight EDR. And now with session recording, I can use it to monitor my print channels. I can use it to monitor my throughput of my copy paste, my printing, and all my virtual channels. So we've always had this concern that what happens if somebody prints a 100,000 page document?
Or transfers files, right, to their local endpoint.
Right. So we've always had the controls to block or
Yeah.
allow. We've never had the.
Yeah. Or even launches certain executables. I believe you can actually key in on that too.
Yeah. So session recording doesn't have to record the session. If you have, privacy concerns, it doesn't have to record the session. You can watch the session and send information to your SIM or your SOC to let them know, hey, something is happening. There's an exfiltration of data, and it's abnormal. I think that one, session recording, definitely a hit. Device trust is a huge hit. So endpoint analysis and adaptive authentication, device posture service. We've always had the ability to pre-authenticate, pre-validate an endpoint, look for certificates, look for registry entries and certain versions, and based off that interrogation, set the context of what they're allowed to do internally as a pre-authentication validation. Device trust is post-authentication, so it can continually validate, and it also validates more. So in certain cases, like GeoIP limiting at when you first come in through device posture service is based off IP. Once you get in with device trust, it's based off of GPS coordinates, Wi-Fi signals, your IP address, several things, and it's a lot more. It's instant. So there's a classic example: you're driving on a train, or you're sitting on a train, and you're crossing a country boundary, and this second country you're allowed in shouldn't allow the access to the application. Well, we can actually dynamically, at the time of crossing the border, not at time of login, actually kick them out of their session or throw a warning to the user saying, hey, you've now, are not compliant, and this is why we're locking you down. I think the WEM stuff with App Locker also, but I think those are my big ones.
Yeah, that's a miss too for customers that don't want to deal with, just based on politics or access controls or whatever. If you don't want to be dealing with App Locker via GPOs, you can deal with App Locker right in WEM.
Yeah. I mentioned security keys earlier. I'll just mention it again. Check them out. But yeah, I think the other thing I think people are missing a lot is Citrix is providing a capability. It's separating the user from their computer. It's separating the user from their work. And that's a security capability, right? It's a pixel air gap that allows us to control where the data is. Citrix at its core is a security technology. So I think, when people don't realize that, or, people look at it as a tool just to deploy X, Y, and Z application versus actually being a security technology, I think that's the other sort of.
It's the original zero trust technology, to be honest.
Yeah.
When you look in hindsight.
So, wow, we're definitely buzzing through this. So, what do you think about your worst day? Like, I talk a lot about tabletop exercises. I talk a lot about preparing. How do you prepare for that worst day? You need to prepare today, because we've all been in the situation where you arrive at somebody's worst day and you realize how ill prepared they are. You realize they don't have a plan, they don't have a process, and they just look at you and go, "Help."
Yeah.
How do you provide for that, worst day scenario?
Everyone hates doing this stuff, to be honest. It's up there with like DRBCP testing, but it's just so essential. As far as our customers, and again, like our customers are heavily varied: public sector, private sector, high security, mass security, different industries, different contexts, what have you. I'd say on the whole, many of them do some form of tabletop exercises as it relates to DRBCP, or hey, crap, we got hacked, or we have to deal with a ransomware thing, whatever the situation is. But often it's disjointed, and often it's handled at an enterprise level that doesn't really get into a lot of the technical details of a given platform, because generally the enterprise level, you're looking at everything across the enterprise, not going really deep into each one of the software stacks that you have in the enterprise itself. Sometimes I've seen the reverse, where there really isn't a lot of unified tabletop exercise guidance happening at the enterprise level, but individual teams are doing it and going deeper. Larger orgs still seem to really focus on the DRBCP and fit cybersecurity into that bucket, but don't necessarily look at things from the vantage point of attack vectors and work backwards to mitigate the outage. We have seen, as of late, some orgs spin up resiliency teams whose jobs it is to handle DRBCP resiliency regardless of the cause from top to bottom. And this means security specialists and technology domain specialists that are being embedded into different tech teams to ensure that those mandates, which is usually driven by different scenarios, are effectively implemented into the platforms and services, and that they're re-architected for resiliency and recovery for a broader set of risks where necessary, really. This also tends to bring greater awareness of other areas of ownership within the technology chain, from restoring VMs to shutting down internet circuits when an attack happens over the weekend, while respecting change control and balancing risk mitigations and downtime impacts. Everything always sounds good on paper until, something happens and the key decision maker is on a plane and has blotchy Wi-Fi, or they're on vacation, or something else happens that takes them out of commission, whatever the case is. And you need to be able to plan for that. Think of it like Netflix's storied chaos monkeys, right? That run around causing random issues, and you need to be resilient enough in how you react to that to make sure that you can still overcome challenges and outages in an expedient manner, and whether that's stopping attacks or being able to recover during an attack or a significant outage of whatever the cause is. On the whole, like I said, it's a little disjointed. I don't feel in general that there is enough tabletop exercises for system availability and cybersecurity resilience being conducted across our customers. And they ought to be done a few times a year at least, as the threat landscape does evolve and the layout within customer environments evolve. Maybe you did a tabletop exercise 9 months ago, but now three-quarters of your infrastructure just got moved to a cloud platform. How does that change things, right? It does change things and changes a number of things. You need to be able to accommodate for that, just as an example of change.
I love
Speaking of,
tabletop. You
go ahead.
mentioned he likes them. I love tabletop exercises. Like it does take you out of your day to day work, right? But on a Friday, getting the team together to think through some things, work through the problems, it is very interesting to me. And in certain cases, like you can see advanced ones where people throw wrenches in, right? Where you have essentially that chaos monkey throwing wrenches. Hey, this person is no longer available. They're on a plane. Now continue your scenario, please. Those kinds of scenarios. And I think what it's really useful for, it's not meant to cause harm or to blame people. What it's meant for is to identify gaps of recovery, backup processes, validation, but it's also meant to get additional investment into the areas you need. We need techniques, we need tools, we need outputs that basically say, hey, this justifies some additional hours for this team to spend on improving something. These tabletop exercises can uncover some things that you may have, come back and go, yeah, I thought I had DR, I thought I had HA, but because this component is single, then I don't really have it. How do I fix that? And go to the business and say, hey, let's fix it, right? So I think it's a great way, but a tabletop exercise that is just weak, has no real outcome, and is really just a time waster is nobody's fan. So
Yeah. Speaking of shutting down, and we're going to go a few minutes overtime here, so folks that can hang back, please do. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. But let's talk about forensics. We get called in for post-infrastructure assessments, as I mentioned, that happens from time to time. What is one thing you wish customers had set up before a breach? And
I'm
again, I
sorry.
just want to, I think you'll agree with this. Assume breach. We have to work from a vantage point that you have to assume that at some point you're going to get hacked or something's going to happen. So what do you wish was customers had set up beforehand?
Well, two things. One, I wish they would think about breach scenarios in which we have a reduced capacity in recovery scenario. Because what will happen is the security team will come in and say, oh, these systems are frozen. We need to investigate them. I need to recover to normal operations. I need to, prescribe medication to the patients. I can't wait for forensics to take a week sitting on this hardware. I need some set aside hardware for recovery and stuff like that. So, number one, planning for the forensics is number one, and having an existing relationship with a partner that can do forensics with you is very useful. But I think when we look at forensics, we're seeing an increased attack sophistication. It used to be, when you talk about the weak attacks that somebody breaks in, trips on a bunch of security tools, leaves a bunch of logs behind, runs away. Forensics are very easy. Let's go look at the local logs. But in reality, the attacks are getting more sophisticated. People are cleaning up after themselves, deleting local logs, deleting local traces. So you need to get those logs off box. Otherwise, you're not going to capture or even know what happened to your system. We've also seen, attackers break into systems and not only cover up their tracks, we've seen them upgrade and apply security patches to our systems so that nobody else can break into those systems, right? So we're seeing an increase, sophistication, specifically with cleaning up after themselves, so that you don't know what the user had done. So the only way to solve for that that's viable is to really record what's happening on the system in some way and redirect that to another system that is hardened, which is the easiest first step is redirecting your logs to a SIM so that when your system is compromised, because it's not when, it's if. It's not if, it's when. Think of it that way, sorry. That it's not that system, right? If you've tripped on a bunch of stuff and you try to clean yourself up, how do you clean up that? You'd have to break into another system, right? And that should have already triggered log alerts and stuff like that. So, and the other thing I'd say is look at your logs before the incident. There's so many times where we get into a scenario where we're looking at logs, and the first time somebody's looked at a log and not realizing that line, that entry in the log file happens all the time, and it's been happening for the last 3 years. The first time you look at your logs should not be the first time under crisis, right? You should look
Yeah.
at what normal operation is, and that's what happens unfortunately too many times is that, oh, we need to do forensics. I've never seen this before, and then you're just wasting a bunch of time. So
Yeah.
it's being effective in the first 24 hours
Yeah.
after incident.
Getting comfortable with your logging for sure. And especially when we're talking Windows systems, you need to make sure you've got the right level of logging on. A default Windows domain deployment is not going to have all the appropriate Active Directory level logging in place. And that should be something that's done immediately. It doesn't require a ton of effort to do, but that should be something that's enabled in all domain controllers and member servers. And if anyone has any questions about that, feel free to send us a note and follow up. Happy to share the information with you. But there's baseline levels of detailed logging that needs to be in place in AD, so you can effectively monitor a lot more of what's going on, who's authenticating against what's happening within a given operating system to help in a forensics situation.
Yeah, and I think something else that we do, and I think it's fun, but others, same vein, don't think it's fun, is threat modeling, right? Within Citrix, we use a couple forms of threat modeling, Stride and Pasta, and a few techniques, and we actually do a training exercise with our employees where it's not just computers, right? We build a scenario where we've taught them some basics of Pasta or Stride, and then we build a scenario like you're trying to protect and threat model a bar that's next to a college campus. Right now, let's have a discussion and let's apply threat modeling to this. And that was very helpful for us to get out of the world of bits and bytes and really think about a risk averse mindset, but looking at that stuff. So threat modeling. Some people see that as academic or something another team does. How do you make it practical, like for your customer or your standard Citrix admin?
Sure. This will be a second last question here. So I'll summarize this as best I can because there's the last question that I want to get asked here. I think is going to be a great way to end this. So threat modeling with the utmost respect to Citrix admins, they're not security specialists. Security is becoming everyone's job though, and hence a security mindset needs to start being imbued in all IT personnel. But for now, we need to keep it simple and remember that a healthy sense of paranoia is very useful. And the easiest way to frame it for a Citrix admin, in my perspective, is to assume that attacker makes their way onto a Citrix host. Just like any physical endpoint, it's a system that users directly log into, they get their grubby little hands over. So are users. And as such, legit user or bad actor, the network segments need to be quarantined off from the rest of the network, heavily firewalled off. If you've got a flat network, you've already failed. You need to make sure you've got firewall rules on the VDIs themselves as well. And you shouldn't be able to hit if you got an HR VDI, you shouldn't be able to RDP to a server in the back end someplace. That just doesn't make any sense. If you got an on-prem environment, keep VDIs isolated on dedicated hosts with management networks on a dedicated subnet, vCenter or Prism Central or SCVMM. Dedicate that to VDI and also keep that on an isolated network. You want to make sure that you pretty much wrap as much of a containment field around anything that a user directly logs into is what I'm getting at here. I talked a lot about OS hardening, so I'm not going to go back on that, but just harden your OS, your endpoints. It's super critical. It's one of the first things you should do as a first line of defense. Block all outbound traffic, internet traffic from the VDAs except for authorized and known websites. You can do this via black hole proxies, but attackers can often override that by removing those configurations. So it's better to handle this upstream on a security device. And it's also not a bad idea to reboot your VDAs daily, especially when you got non-persistent systems, because if an attacker has gotten into a system and starts trying to inject and build code and scripts or whatnot, as soon as that reboots, all that stuff gets wiped away. So, lastly, auditing on the endpoint. Windows has got numerous advanced configs to log what's going on in the command line, PowerShell, so on and so forth. And when it's properly monitored by a good SOC, you can be alerted as soon as something strange is going on and minimize damage by taking action. In worst case, you'll have improved visibility as to what exactly happened during an analysis. So, to put it another way, assume someone breaks into your house. How do you design your home to secure your sensitive belongings and make it difficult for a burglar to move from room to room and onto your valuables? Your alarm systems and cameras are your audit logs, and they work best when they're actively being monitored. All right, last tier, ransomware recovery. We've got clients who think, I got backups, I'm fine. What are they missing?
Okay, we have another hour, right? Um, I think there was a big wave of ransomware recovery a few years ago, right? Healthcare was getting hit pretty hard, and and I've seen various forms of ransomware where, people are trying to break into a system when they give up, they just ransomware it or whatever. Or it's part of a set of attacks where it's, you know, one issue over here, but they're actually doing an attack over here and so forth. But I feel it's about recovery. It usually starts at recovery, unfortunately, because there's not always enough prep. Um, restoring 5,000, 10,000 VMs takes some time. So understanding what needs to be restored first and second and third in the first 24 hours is really important. And there's a healthcare story. It's a bit of a famous story where I was in a room and a customer was reviewing their security environment and telling me about their backup and recovery technique. And it was obvious that it was going to take 3 to 5 months to recover their Citrix environment. So I suggested, hey, let's go to Best Buy, I'll buy a hard drive, a NAS, and then we'll just solve this today. It's not the right solution, but at least you'll be able to get by it all. So being able to understand what has to be recovered, the speed at which it recovers is really important. In a ransomware event, in an incident, when I first step in, my first question is usually, how far did it get? And the answer isn't always, I know the answer, this is how far they got. It's, we know it got this far, we don't know how much further, right? We see ransomware, we see the endpoints infected, we see a bit of the infrastructure infected, or something like how much of that infrastructure needs to restore from backup. Or is there a decision that I don't have time to do the forensics, everything's got to be restored? And we see that in a few scenarios in the last couple of weeks, not our customers, but where they've had to restore everything, right? And how far do you have to go back, right? We used to learn this technique, grandfather, father, son backup cycles, and keeping backups offsite, immutable, having multiple copies, but selecting the right one, because you might restore to a place where you weren't ransomwared, but you might have still been backdoored, right? So like,
Yeah.
how far do you go
Yeah,
back?
they time bomb these things now, right? For
Yeah.
that specific reason. Again, these attackers are very, very patient. If you were only going back 3 months or whatnot, they may have time bombed that 4 months ago. So what you recover ends up being ransomware as soon as you power it up.
And like, we've had issues. Like, so one customer, um, we showed up on site to help with the recovery. The front computer was also ransomware, so the security guard couldn't let us into the building to help with recovery because their computer at the front desk was also hit. So then we had to find a phone number, which is no phone books anymore, of somebody to let us in the building. So it was kind of crazy. So this cascading effect, right? And when the Unidesk thing is, the Unicon technology is pretty sweet right now. The CrowdStrike situation happened where everybody's endpoints got blue screened overnight. There is a scenario where you could take a Unicon thumb drive and just plug it into a computer, and even if that computer is ransomware, you can boot from a known trusted
Yeah,
environment,
rapid recovery.
rapid recovery. At least your end users there, and we don't. I'm trying not to be in the business of managing endpoints that are distributed, that are impossible to have desk side support, right? I need to simplify my edge, centralize my technologies, and have quick recovery methods. And then, what is the recovery time objective, recovery point objective of the systems? Is very important. And having some of this stuff ahead of time, maintaining the right amount of evidence. Like I said, sometimes you're handcuffed by the forensics team saying, "Hey, you can't do this, you can't do that," and you're just trying to, save some lives. But ransomware, it's tough because you don't know how far it got in. You kind of want to err on the side of caution and recover further back in time. And there's concerns there. And like, yeah, there's just having to have a clean picture at the time of crisis is impossible. You don't really know how bad it was until like a month later in a lot of cases, right? So like, what can you do today to recover and get core business services back online in a safe way, and not recovering something that you're just not ransomware again the next day?
Yeah.
Uh, Kind of tough.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
BBS,
So,
BBS are great. I'll say that. Those are fantastic technologies to recover, as long as those backups for those images are clean.
Sarah, want to bring us home?
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I know we all learned so much. I know I did. If you would like to take any next steps at Ferroque, we have our Citrix infrastructure assessment, and these experts can help you out along your journey. You can also optimize your Citrix renewal with us. We can help you there. We also have a great blog. I think we're up to 70 specific blogs related to Citrix and Citrix, improvements or issues. So you're
Oh, we're well beyond that. It's got to be in the hundreds.
It's gotta be. That's the last I checked. So please check that out as well. And you can schedule a conversation with us if you have any further questions. So thank you all again, and we appreciate that you took the time to spend with us.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah, for administering this and moderating rather. And Eric, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. I'm sure we'll do something like this soon again on some other topic, but awesome information, great conversations, and hope we've been able to provide some value to folks that are listening to us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.